The red dust of New Mesa swirled around Jack Morrison's boots as he walked through the colony's main street. The 16-year-old boy had lived on this frontier world his entire life and knew every building and every face in Red Rock Station. His father Daniel worked as the chief mining engineer, managing the extractium refineries that kept the colony alive. They were part of 300 families who had chosen to make their home on this distant planet, far from the safety of Earth's protected systems. Jack and his father were descendants of the Navajo Nation, though they were now thousands of light years from their ancestral homeland. Daniel had worked hard to teach his son their language and traditions, spending evenings sharing stories of their people and the warriors who came before them. Jack understood some Navajo words but struggled with the deeper meanings his father tried to share. Life on a mining colony left little time for cultural preservation when survival demanded constant attention. The morning started like any other, until the Kreth ships appeared in the sky. 6 massive warships dropped out of hyperspace and took positions over Red Rock Station. The reptilian Kreth Empire had been expanding aggressively through this sector, and human colonies existed only because the Kreth had not yet decided to remove them. Every few months, Kreth inspection teams would visit and demand tribute from the colonists, taking refined extractium and supplies while offering nothing in return. Commander Vex led the Kreth squadron that descended on Red Rock Station that day. He was a towering figure, nearly 8 feet tall with scales that gleamed like polished bronze. His warriors spread through the colony, searching buildings and frightening children while their commander made his way to the mining facility. Daniel Morrison met him there, trying to maintain diplomatic courtesy while explaining the colony's production capacity. The conversation went badly from the start. Commander Vex demanded twice the usual tribute, claiming the Kreth Empire required additional resources for expansion. Daniel explained carefully that the colony barely produced enough extractium to meet basic needs, and that doubling the tribute would leave them without fuel for their generators and ships. The Kreth commander's eyes narrowed at what he perceived as defiance from an inferior species. Jack had followed his father to the mining facility and watched the exchange from a distance. He saw Commander Vex's posture change, saw the subtle signals that the Kreth warriors recognized as orders. Before Daniel could react, 4 Kreth soldiers seized him and began dragging him toward the colony's central square. Jack ran after them, shouting for them to stop, but a Kreth warrior grabbed him and forced him to his knees. The central square of Red Rock Station filled with colonists as word spread of what was happening. Peter Grant, the colony's security chief, tried to intervene, but found himself facing down 20 armed Kreth warriors. The colonists could only watch in horror as Commander Vex made an example of the human who dared question his authority. The beating was systematic and brutal. Commander Vex used his armored fists to break Daniel Morrison's ribs one by one, explaining to the gathered crowd that this was the price of resistance. When Daniel fell, the Kreth commander kicked him repeatedly, targeting his spine and kidneys with precision designed to cause maximum pain without immediate death. Jack screamed and fought against the warrior holding him, but the Kreth's grip was like iron. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Commander Vex finally stopped. Daniel Morrison lay motionless in the red dust, blood pooling beneath him. The Kreth commander turned to address the colonists, speaking in heavily accented English. He informed them that the tribute had now tripled and they had 30 days to deliver it. Failure to comply would result in the liquidation of the entire colony. With that, the Kreth warriors returned to their ships and departed, leaving destruction and fear in their wake. Dr. Helen White rushed to Daniel's side the moment the Kreth were gone. She was the colony's only medical officer and had limited equipment to handle trauma this severe. Jack knelt beside his father as Helen assessed the damage. Multiple broken bones, internal bleeding, possible spinal injury. She ordered Daniel moved to the small hospital immediately and began emergency treatment. For 3 days, Daniel drifted between consciousness and delirium. Jack sat by his bedside constantly, holding his father's hand and listening to him mumble in Navajo. During brief lucid moments, Daniel would try to speak to his son about their heritage and the warrior traditions of their ancestors. He talked about honor and justice, about standing against darkness even when the odds seemed impossible. In one particularly clear moment, he gripped Jack's hand tightly and whispered words in Navajo that Jack did not fully understand, but felt deep in his chest. The colony struggled to comprehend the impossible demand Commander Vex had made. Peter Grant called a meeting in the community hall where he laid out the grim mathematics. Even if they stripped every ship of fuel and shut down all non-essential systems, they could not produce 1/3 of the demanded tribute in 30 days. The nearest Earth Defense Force station was 4 weeks away by the fastest ship, and even if they called for help immediately, no rescue could arrive in time. Some colonists advocated for evacuation, but there were not enough ships to carry everyone, and abandoning their homes meant losing everything they had built. Others wanted to fight, though everyone knew their small arms and handful of security personnel could not stand against Kreth warriors. The meeting dissolved into arguments and despair, as the colonists realized they had no good options. Jack sat alone in his family's quarters that night, thinking about his father lying broken in the hospital, and about Commander Vex's smug satisfaction as he delivered his ultimatum. Something burned inside Jack's chest, a feeling he had never experienced before. His father had always taught him that the Navajo way was one of harmony and balance. But his father had also spoken of warriors who fought to protect their people when harmony failed. Jack accessed the colony's database and began searching for information about Navajo settlements on other worlds. He learned that when humanity first began colonizing distant planets, Earth's governments had specifically recruited indigenous communities who wanted to preserve their cultures away from the homogenizing influence of major population centers. Large groups from the Navajo Nation had accepted this opportunity and established thriving communities on several colony worlds. One planet caught Jack's attention. Canyon World was 3 hyperspace jumps from New Mesa and housed over 50,000 people of Navajo descent. According to the database, they had maintained their language, traditions, and warrior culture across generations. They even had organized defense forces that trained in both modern combat and traditional fighting methods. Jack made his decision in that moment. The colony had no one to help them, but perhaps somewhere in the vastness of space there were people who would understand what had happened to his father and who might be willing to fight for justice. He did not know if Canyon World would help, but he knew he had to try. He began quietly gathering supplies and planning his departure, telling no one of his intentions because he knew they would try to stop him. Jack waited until the 3rd night after his father's beating to make his move. The colony had settled into a tense routine as people tried to mine enough extractium to meet Commander Vex's impossible demands while caring for their injured and frightened families. Security patrols focused on the mining facilities and residential areas, leaving the small spaceport with minimal monitoring. Jack knew the security codes because his father had taught him basic systems operations years ago. The cargo runner Desert Wind sat in the corner of the landing field, scheduled for a supply run to a neighboring colony in 2 weeks. Jack had studied the ship's specifications and knew it could make the journey to Canyon World if he pushed the hyperdrive engines hard and rationed the supplies carefully. He moved through the darkness carrying a pack with food, water, and data chips containing information about New Mesa and his father's attack. Breaking into the Desert Wind took less than 5 minutes. Jack had watched maintenance crews work on these ships dozens of times and knew where the access panels were located. He slipped inside and sealed the hatch behind him, then made his way to the cockpit. The control systems powered up with a soft hum, and Jack began entering coordinates for his first jump. His hands shook slightly as he activated the engines. The Desert Wind lifted off smoothly, rising into the night sky before anyone in the colony realized what was happening. By the time Peter Grant's security team reached the spaceport, Jack was already accelerating toward the hyperspace jump point. He heard radio calls ordering him to return, but he ignored them and focused on his navigation. The ship shuddered as it entered hyperspace, and New Mesa vanished behind him. The journey to Canyon World would take 11 days through 3 different hyperspace lanes. Jack had never traveled alone before, and had never been more than a few light years from home. The silence of space pressed in on him as he settled into the pilot's chair and watched stars streak past the viewports. He thought about his father lying in the hospital, about his mother who had died when he was young, about the colonists facing impossible odds against Kreth brutality. During the long hours between jump points, Jack explored the ship's database and studied everything he could find about Navajo history and culture. He read about the Long Walk, when his ancestors were forced from their homeland and marched hundreds of miles to imprisonment. He learned about the code talkers who used their language to help win wars on Old Earth, creating unbreakable codes that confused enemies. He discovered stories of warriors and leaders who fought to protect their people against overwhelming odds. Jack practiced speaking Navajo using language programs in the database. His father had taught him basic words and phrases, but he had never taken the lessons seriously. Now he worked for hours each day repeating words until his tongue could form the sounds properly. He would need to speak to the people of Canyon World in their own language if he wanted them to understand why he had come so far. The first jump point came after 3 days of travel. Jack's heart pounded as the desert wind dropped back into normal space, and he immediately began calculations for the next jump. Everything depended on precise navigation because any error could add weeks to his journey or strand him in empty space. The second jump went smoothly, but the third jump brought complications. Hyperspace navigation required careful attention to stellar drift and gravitational anomalies. Jack had studied the basics but lacked the experience of professional pilots. When the desert wind emerged from the final jump, he found himself several million kilometers off course from Canyon World's system. He spent 6 anxious hours correcting his trajectory and approaching the planet, burning fuel he could barely spare. Canyon World finally appeared in his viewports like a vision from his father's stories. The planet's surface resembled the American Southwest of old Earth, with red rock formations, deep canyons, and desert plains stretching to distant mountains. Cities and settlements dotted the landscape, connected by roads and transit systems that followed the natural contours of the land. Jack saw massive structures that blended traditional Navajo architecture with modern colonial engineering. As the desert wind entered the planet's atmosphere, traffic control contacted him and demanded identification. Jack explained in halting Navajo that he came from New Mesa and needed to speak with the Council of Elders about an urgent matter. The controller's tone changed immediately when Jack mentioned New Mesa and his father's name. He was given landing coordinates at the capital city's main spaceport. Monument Valley spread beneath him as Jack brought the ship down. The city was larger than anything he had imagined, with hundreds of thousands of people living in a sprawling metropolis that somehow maintained harmony with the surrounding landscape. Traditional hogans stood alongside modern towers, and Jack could see people walking the streets in clothing that mixed ancestral designs with practical colonial attire. Jack landed the desert wind and stepped out onto solid ground for the first time in 11 days. His legs wobbled slightly from the extended time in low gravity, but he forced himself to stand straight as spaceport officials approached. He stated his purpose in simple Navajo, asking to meet with the Council of Elders. The officials looked at the exhausted teenager with his worn clothes and desperate eyes. Then one of them made a call. Within an hour, Jack found himself being escorted through Monument Valley toward the council chambers. The city overwhelmed his senses with its size and vibrancy. People spoke Navajo everywhere he went, and he heard English only occasionally. Market stalls sold traditional crafts alongside advanced technology. Children played in parks while their parents worked in offices and factories. This was what his father had tried to explain when he talked about preserving their heritage. Them and the council chambers occupied a large building that resembled a traditional hogan but stood 3 stories tall and incorporated meeting rooms, offices, and ceremonial spaces. Jack was taken to a waiting room where he sat nervously for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes. He rehearsed what he would say, trying to find words that would make the council understand the urgency of his request. Finally, a young woman in a military uniform came to escort him to the main chamber. She introduced herself as Lieutenant Sophie Begay, daughter of Elder Joseph Begay, who led the council. She studied Jack with sharp eyes and asked him directly why he had come. Jack took a deep breath and began telling her about Commander Vex, about his father's beating, about the impossible tribute and the threat hanging over Red Rock Station. Sophie's expression darkened as she listened. When Jack finished, she nodded slowly and told him the council would hear his petition. She warned him that Canyon World had remained neutral in most conflicts and that convincing the elders to take action would not be easy. Jack thanked her and followed her into the council chamber, knowing that everything depended on the next few hours and whether he could find the right words to awaken the warrior spirit his father always spoke about. The council chamber was circular with wooden beams crossing overhead in patterns that held traditional meaning Jack did not fully understand. 12 elders sat in chairs arranged in a semicircle, their faces weathered with age and wisdom. Elder Joseph Bigay occupied the central position, his silver hair braided and his eyes sharp despite his advanced years. Sophie stood beside her father while Jack was directed to stand in the center of the room facing the council. Elder Bigay spoke first, welcoming Jack in formal Navajo and asking him to present his petition. Jack's mouth went dry as he looked at the assembled elders. These were leaders who had built an entire thriving world for their people, who had preserved traditions across light years and generations. He was just a scared teenager from a failing colony, asking them to risk everything they had built. Jack began speaking in Navajo, using the simple words and phrases he had practiced during his journey. He told them about New Mesa and the 300 families trying to survive on a harsh world. He described his father Daniel, a good man who worked to preserve their heritage while keeping the colony's systems running. He explained how Commander Vex and his warriors had come demanding tribute, and how his father had tried to negotiate reasonably. The words came harder when Jack reached the part about the beating. His voice broke as he described watching Kreth warriors drag his father into the square and break him piece by piece while colonists were forced to watch. He switched to English when his Navajo failed, tears running down his face as he told them about sitting by his father's hospital bed and listening to him whisper about honor and warriors and standing against darkness. Jack finished by explaining the impossible, tribute demand and the 30-day deadline that was already half gone. He told the council that Red Rock Station had no way to defend itself and no one to call for help. He had come to Canyon World because his father always said their people looked after each other, that the warrior tradition meant protecting those who could not protect themselves. He knew he was asking for something huge, but he had nowhere else to turn. Silence filled the chamber when Jack finished speaking. The elders sat motionless, their expressions unreadable. Jack felt his hope draining away as the seconds stretched into minutes. Finally, Elder Bigay spoke, his voice gentle but firm. The elder explained that Canyon World had thrived precisely because they avoided entangling themselves in conflicts between other species. The Kreth Empire was powerful and aggressive, and if Canyon World sent warriors to fight them, it would invite retaliation. The safety of 50,000 people living on this world had to be considered carefully. Canyon World had built something precious here, a place where their culture flourished and their children grew up speaking their language and knowing their traditions. Risking that for a distant colony was not a decision to make lightly. Other elders spoke, some echoing Joseph Bigay's concerns while others expressed sympathy for Jack's situation. One elder pointed out that Earth Defense Forces existed specifically to protect colonies, and that New Mesa should appeal to them for help. Another noted that interfering in Kreth affairs could destabilize the entire region. Jack listened to each argument and felt his last hope crumbling. Then Sophie Bigay stepped forward and asked permission to address the council. Her father nodded, though his expression showed he suspected what she would say. Sophie spoke with passion and conviction, reminding the elders of their history. She talked about the code talkers who had traveled far from their homes to fight against tyranny, about warriors who defended the innocent even when it meant personal sacrifice. She asked whether their warrior tradition was just empty ritual, or whether it still meant something real. Sophie pointed out that the Navajo had never achieved safety by hiding from evil, but by standing against it. She reminded the council about the long walk and the generations of struggle their ancestors endured, and how they had survived by never forgetting who they were and what they stood for. She argued that neutrality in the face of brutality was its own form of surrender, and that turning away from Jack and his father meant abandoning the values they claimed to preserve. The council chamber erupted in heated debate. Younger elders supported Sophie's position, while older ones warned about the dangers of military intervention. Arguments flew back and forth about duty and safety, about heritage and pragmatism. Jack stood silent in the center, afraid to hope, but unable to stop himself from hoping anyway. Elder Bigay finally raised his hand, and the chamber fell silent. He looked at his daughter with something like pride mixed with exasperation, then turned his gaze to Jack. The old man studied the teenager for a long moment before speaking. He said that Jack had shown remarkable courage by making the journey alone, and that his father had raised him well. The situation on New Mesa was exactly the kind of injustice that the warrior tradition was meant to confront. However, Elder Begay continued. The Council could not officially sanction military action against the Kreth without putting the entire planet at risk. Canyon World's government would remain neutral in this conflict, but the Council also recognized that individual citizens had the right to make their own choices about honor and duty. If warriors wished to volunteer to travel to New Mesa and face the Kreth, the Council would not prevent them from doing so. Those who went would go as individuals following their own conscience, not as representatives of Canyon World. Sophie smiled at her father's careful wording. She immediately requested permission to organize a volunteer force, and Elder Begay granted it with obvious reluctance. The council session ended shortly after, with several elders approaching Jack to offer private words of support or encouragement. One elderly woman pressed a small silver pendant into his hand, telling him it had belonged to her grandfather, who was a code talker in the old wars. Sophie led Jack out of the council chamber and took him to a military facility on the edge of Monument Valley. She explained that she would put out a call for volunteers immediately and would organize whatever force assembled. She warned Jack not to expect too many warriors, as going to fight the Kreth was a serious commitment that few would make. Jack thanked her, still overwhelmed by the fact that anyone had agreed to help at all. That evening, Sophie sent out her call through military channels and civilian networks. She explained the situation on New Mesa honestly, holding nothing back about the dangers involved. She made clear that this was a volunteer mission without official sanction, that warriors who went might face Kreth retaliation, and that some might not come back. She asked only that those with warrior hearts and the courage to stand against injustice consider joining her. Jack fell asleep that night in guest quarters Sophie had arranged, exhausted from his journey and the emotional strain of the council meeting. He dreamed of his father and of Kreth warriors of red dust and blood. When he woke the next morning, Sophie was waiting outside his door with an expression he could not quite read. She told him to come with her, that there was something he needed to see. Sophie drove Jack through Monument Valley in a military vehicle as the sun rose over the red rock formations. She said nothing during the drive, but Jack could see anticipation in her posture. They traveled to a massive hangar complex on the northern edge of the city, where training facilities for Canyon World's defense forces were located. Jack saw military equipment and personnel moving with purpose, but Sophie drove past all of it to a landing field behind the main structures. What Jack saw when they arrived made his breath catch in his throat. The landing field was packed with people, hundreds of them, maybe more. They stood in loose formations while military personnel moved among them with data pads and equipment scanners. Sophie stopped the vehicle and turned to Jack with a slight smile. She told him that her call for volunteers had gone out less than 24 hours ago, and this was the response. Jack stepped out onto the field and stared in disbelief. Men and women of all ages filled the space, from young adults barely older than himself to grizzled veterans with gray hair and scarred faces. They wore civilian clothes but carried themselves with military bearing. Many had already been issued basic gear and were checking weapons and armor. Sophie explained that volunteers were still arriving, that the count had passed 400 and was still climbing. A broad-shouldered man with silver streaks in his black hair approached them. Sophie introduced him as Captain John Yellowhorse, a veteran of 40 years in Canyon World's defense forces and multiple conflicts with raiders and hostile species. Captain Yellowhorse shook Jack's hand with a grip like iron and told him in heavily accented English that his father's beating had angered many people. The warrior tradition meant something real on Canyon World, and these volunteers were here to prove it. Jack walked through the assembled warriors with Sophie and Captain Yellowhorse, overwhelmed by what he was seeing. A young woman named Lisa Nez, a combat medic, told him she had a son the same age as Jack and could not imagine watching him suffer as Jack had suffered. An older man named George Bennett, a mining engineer who had fought in the defense forces decades ago, said that Kreth brutality could not go unanswered, or it would spread like disease. The volunteers came from every part of Canyon World society. There were current Defense Force members taking leave to join the mission, veterans who had not worn armor in years but still knew how to fight, and civilians with military training who felt called to action. Some came from ranches in the deep desert, others from the cities and industrial centers. What united them was the conviction that the warriors' path meant protecting the innocent, regardless of personal cost. Sophie and Captain Yellowhorse organized the volunteers into tactical units, Throughout the morning, they formed 20 squads of 20 warriors each, led by experienced squad leaders who had combat training. The force included not just infantry but specialists in combat engineering, medical support, communications, and intelligence gathering. Captain Yellowhorse explained that the Kreth were dangerous opponents and that victory would require more than just courage. The biggest challenge was transportation. Canyon World's defense forces had military ships, but using them would contradict the Council's statement of neutrality. Sophie had anticipated this problem and arranged for 3 large cargo ships to be converted for the mission. The vessels were civilian-owned, volunteered by their captains who wanted to support the operation. Military personnel worked frantically to install weapon systems and defensive shields salvaged from decommissioned patrol craft. The 3 ships were named Windtalker, Long Walk, and Sacred Mountain. Each could carry about 150 people with equipment and supplies. The modifications were crude but effective, turning peaceful cargo haulers into makeshift warships. Sophie explained to Jack that the ships would never match dedicated Kreth warships in direct combat, but with good tactics and determination, they might be enough. Over the next 3 days, the volunteer force prepared for departure. Warriors trained together, learning each other's strengths and developing coordination. Squad leaders drilled their units on boarding actions, defensive formations, and urban combat tactics. Medical teams assembled supplies and planned triage procedures. Engineers studied schematics of Kreth technology to identify vulnerabilities they could exploit. Jack watched it all with amazement and growing hope. These warriors were preparing to risk their lives for people they had never met, traveling across space to face an enemy that outnumbered them, all because a teenage boy had asked for help, and they believed in the warrior tradition their ancestors had passed down through generations. Sophie assigned Jack a position on the Windtalker's bridge during the battle. She told him honestly that he lacked combat training and would be a liability in the fighting, but that he deserved to see his home again and witness what his courage had set in motion. Jack accepted the assignment without argument, knowing she was right and grateful that he would not be left behind. On the evening before departure, Elder Joseph Bigay came to the hangar complex to address the warriors. He brought other council members with him, even those who had argued against involvement in the conflict. The volunteers assembled in formation while the elders stood before them. Jack stood with Sophie near the front, close enough to see the old man's face clearly. Elder Bigay spoke in Navajo, his voice carrying across the field. He told the warriors that they were following a path their ancestors would recognize, standing against darkness to protect the innocent. He reminded them that they carried the spirits of all who came before, that the code talkers and ancient warriors watched over them, that they fought not for glory or conquest, but for justice and honor. He said that Canyon World could not officially sanction their actions, but that every person on the planet would be praying for their success and safe return. The elder then performed a traditional blessing ceremony, calling on spiritual protection for the warriors. He burned sacred herbs and spoke prayers that had been passed down for countless generations. Many of the warriors closed their eyes and touched the traditional symbols they wore on chains around their necks or painted on their armor. Jack felt something powerful in that moment, a connection to something larger than himself that he had never quite understood before. After the ceremony, the warriors dispersed to spend their last evening with families and friends. Sophie took Jack to meet her mother and younger brother, introducing him as the reason this mission existed. Her mother hugged Jack tightly and told him his father must be very proud. Her brother, barely 12 years old, looked at Jack with awe and said he wanted to be as brave someday. That night, Jack lay in his quarters and thought about the journey ahead. The Windtalker would depart at dawn, carrying 400 warriors toward a confrontation with the Kreth Empire. Jack knew that some of these people might die because of his request for help, and the weight of that responsibility pressed heavily on him. But he also knew that his father had taught him about honor and standing against evil, and that these warriors understood those lessons better than he ever had. Tomorrow they would begin the journey back to New Mesa, and Commander Vex would learn that attacking one human family had awakened something he could not comprehend. The 3 ships lifted from Canyon World at dawn, rising through the atmosphere in close formation. Jack stood on the bridge of the Windtalker beside Sophie and Captain Yellowhorse, watching the planet shrink behind them. The cargo vessel's bridge had been modified with additional control stations and tactical displays that showed the positions of the Long Walk and Sacred Mountain. 400 warriors were distributed among the 3 ships, each person prepared for the battle ahead. The journey to New Mesa would take 7 days through hyperspace, retracing the route Jack had traveled alone weeks earlier. The warriors used the time to continue training, running combat simulations and practicing coordination between units. Sophie proved to be an exceptional commander, moving between ships via shuttle to check on every squad and ensure everyone understood the mission parameters. Captain Yellowhorse focused on the veteran warriors, planning tactics based on his decades of combat experience. Jack felt useless during much of the journey. He had no combat skills to contribute and limited knowledge of military operations. Sophie sensed his frustration and assigned him to work with the communications team, teaching him how their systems worked. The communications specialists were particularly important because they would be using Navajo language for all tactical coordination, creating an unbreakable code that the Kreth could not decipher. A young woman named Rachel Stone led the communications team. She had studied ancient code talker techniques and adapted them for modern warfare, developing protocols that allowed complex military information to be transmitted quickly in Navajo. Rachel spent hours teaching Jack the specific terminology they would use, explaining how words for animals and natural features had been assigned to represent military equipment and tactical concepts. During the second day of travel, Sophie called a meeting of all squad leaders on the Wind Talker. Jack attended as an observer, listening as she laid out their strategy. Intelligence gathered from public sources suggested that Commander Vex typically deployed 6 warships when visiting colonies, along with ground forces of roughly 200 warriors. The Kreth were experienced fighters with superior technology, but they relied heavily on intimidation and overwhelming force rather than sophisticated tactics. Sophie's plan exploited this weakness. The 3 cargo ships would drop out of hyperspace at maximum weapons range and immediately engage the Kreth warships. The goal was not to win a direct space battle, but to create chaos and force the Kreth to divide their attention. While the space battle raged, 200 warriors would make combat drops directly into Red Rock Station, securing the civilian population and engaging Kreth ground forces. Captain Yellowhorse added details about the ground operation. Squads would drop in coordinated patterns to create defensive perimeters around key locations, including the hospital where Daniel Morrison and other injured colonists were being treated. Other units would assault Kreth positions and capture their command structure. The entire operation depended on speed and surprise, hitting the Kreth before they could organize an effective response. The squad leaders asked tactical questions and raised concerns about various scenarios. Sophie addressed each issue methodically, demonstrating that she had thought through contingencies and backup plans. Jack realized he was watching military professionals at work, people who took their craft seriously and understood that mistakes cost lives. These warriors were not reckless or suicidal, but calculated and determined. On the 4th day, the mood on the ship shifted as warriors made personal preparations for battle. Many spent time in meditation or prayer, connecting with spiritual traditions that helped them face the possibility of death. Others wrote messages to families back on Canyon World, to be delivered if they did not return. Jack saw a grizzled veteran carefully painting traditional symbols on his armor, while a young warrior nearby checked and rechecked her weapons with nervous energy. Sophie found Jack standing alone in an observation room, staring out at the stars streaking past. She sat beside him and asked how he was holding up. Jack admitted he was terrified, both that the mission would fail and that people would die because of him. Sophie told him that every person on these ships had made their own choice to be here, that no one blamed him for the situation, and that fear was natural and healthy before combat. She then shared something personal, telling Jack about her first combat experience years ago when pirates attacked a mining convoy. She had been young and scared and had made mistakes that got people hurt, but she learned from those mistakes and became a better warrior and leader. She said that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite fear, and that Jack had already shown more courage than most people ever would. The conversation helped Jack feel less alone with his anxiety. He asked Sophie why she had chosen to lead this mission when she could have stayed safely on Canyon World. She explained that her father had taught her the Warrior tradition was not just about fighting, but about using strength to protect others. She had seen too many examples of bullies and tyrants getting away with cruelty, because no one stood against them. When Jack told his story to the council, she knew immediately that this was a situation where warriors were needed. On the 6th day, Captain Yellowhorse gathered the warriors for a final briefing. He stood before them in full combat armor decorated with traditional patterns, looking every inch the veteran warrior he was. He spoke plainly about what they would face, not sugarcoating the dangers or guaranteeing victory. The Kreth were tough, experienced, and ruthless. Some warriors would likely be wounded and some might die, but they were fighting for something that mattered, defending people who could not defend themselves, and that purpose would give them an edge the Kreth could not match. The captain then did something that surprised Jack. He asked Jack to come forward and tell the warriors about his father and about Red Rock Station. Jack stammered through a description of the colony and the people there, talking about families trying to build lives on a harsh world, about children playing in the streets and neighbors helping each other survive. He talked about his father, Daniel, a good man who worked hard and treated everyone with respect, who tried to negotiate peacefully and was beaten unconscious for it. When Jack finished, the warriors were silent for a moment. Then Lisa Nez, the combat medic, stood and said that she fought for Daniel Morrison and for all the parents trying to protect their children from brutality. George Bennett stood and said he fought so that miners like himself could work without fear of alien tyrants. One by one, warriors stood and stated why they fought, creating a chain of purpose that connected them all. The 7th day arrived, and the 3 ships prepared to drop out of hyperspace into New Mesa's system. Warriors donned their armor and checked their weapons one final time. Sophie stood on the Windtalker's bridge coordinating final preparations across all 3 ships. Captain Yellowhorse moved among the warriors, offering last words of encouragement and tactical reminders. Jack stood at his assigned station in the communications center, his heart pounding as Rachel Stone ran through final protocol checks. The countdown began, and Jack realized there was no turning back now. In moments, they would emerge into normal space and face the Kreth Empire. He thought of his father lying in the hospital and of Commander Vex's cruel satisfaction. He thought of the 400 warriors who had answered his call. The hyperspace engines whined as the ships prepared to transition, and Jack whispered a prayer in Navajo that his father had taught him years ago. The 3 ships dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of New Mesa's system, and their sensors immediately detected the Kreth presence. 6 warships orbited the planet in standard patrol formation, their weapon systems active and shields raised. Sophie had hoped to catch them relaxed and unprepared, but Commander Vex was too experienced to let his guard down completely. The Kreth warships began moving to intercept the moment the human ships appeared. Sophie gave orders calmly over the communications network, speaking in Navajo as Rachel Stone translated her words into tactical commands. The Windtalker, Longwalk, and Sacred Mountain spread into attack formation and accelerated toward the planet. Their modified weapons powered up, crude compared to military-grade systems but deadly enough at close range. The Kreth commander probably assumed these were civilian ships attempting a foolish rescue and would be easy prey. The first Kreth warship opened fire when the human ships came within range, particle beams lancing through space toward the Windtalker. Sophie had anticipated this, and the cargo ship rolled hard, evading most of the incoming fire while return shots from its improvised weapons struck the Kreth vessel's shields. The other 2 human ships targeted different Kreth warships, spreading the enemy's defensive attention across multiple threats. Jack watched from the communications station as tactical displays showed the battle developing. The 3 human ships moved erratically, using maneuvers no military captain would attempt because they pushed the vessels beyond safe operational limits. Sophie was gambling that cargo ships built to survive rough handling could take more punishment than the Kreth expected. Her gamble paid off when the Long Walk absorbed several direct hits that should have destroyed it, but kept fighting. Captain Yellowhorse commanded the ground forces from the Sacred Mountain, coordinating the combat drop, while the space battle provided distraction. 200 warriors and drop pods launched from all 3 ships simultaneously, screaming toward New Mesa's surface on trajectories calculated to land them directly in Red Rock Station. The Kreth warships tried to target the pods but could not ignore the human ships that continued hammering at their shields. The space battle intensified as the Windtalker closed to point blank. ranged with a Kreth warship and unleashed everything it had. The crude weapons overheated and threatened to explode, but they punched through the Kreth shields and tore into the warship's hull. Atmosphere vented from breached sections and the Kreth vessel began spinning out of control. Sophie immediately targeted a second warship, pressing the attack with reckless aggression that kept the Kreth off balance. On the ground, Commander Vex stood in Red Rock Station's central square, the same place where he had beaten Daniel Morrison weeks earlier. He was preparing to make another example of the colony's leadership when his warriors reported explosions in orbit. Before he could process this information, the sky filled with drop pods trailing fire as they plummeted toward the settlement. Vex realized with shock that someone was actually attacking his position. The drop pods slammed into the ground around Red Rock Station in a coordinated pattern that Captain Yellowhorse had planned meticulously. Warriors emerged firing, their weapons targeting Kreth positions with precision based on intelligence Jack had provided about the colony's layout. The Kreth ground forces, numbering about 200, had been scattered throughout the settlement to maintain control. Now they found themselves under simultaneous assault from multiple directions by an enemy that had appeared from nowhere. Lisa Nez led a squad of 20 warriors toward the colony hospital where Daniel Morrison and other injured colonists were being held. Kreth guards outside the building opened fire, but the Navajo warriors moved with practiced coordination, using cover effectively and supporting each other with overlapping fields of fire. Lisa's squad eliminated the guards within 2 minutes and secured the hospital entrance. George Bennett commanded a combat engineering unit tasked with neutralizing Kreth defensive positions. His warriors carried specialized equipment to breach fortifications and disable weapon emplacements. They moved methodically through the colony's industrial sector, eliminating Kreth strongpoints and freeing colonists who had been forced to work under guard. George's calm experience steadied younger warriors who had never seen real combat before. Captain Yellowhorse himself led the assault on the Kreth command post, a fortified position in the mining facility. The Kreth had chosen this location because it gave them control over the colony's power generation and communications. Yellowhorse's force of 40 warriors attacked from 3 sides simultaneously, using the confusion of the broader battle to mask their approach. The fighting was intense and close quarters, with warriors and Kreth troops clashing in the narrow corridors. In orbit, the space battle reached a critical point. The Windtalker had destroyed one Kreth warship and crippled a second, but had taken severe damage to its engines and life support. The Long Walk was still fighting but leaking atmosphere from multiple hull breaches. The Sacred Mountain had dropped its warriors and was now running interference, using its bulk to shield the damaged human ships from Kreth fire. Sophie made a command decision that Jack heard relayed through the communications network. She ordered all 3 human ships to concentrate fire on a single Kreth warship, overwhelming its defenses through sheer volume of fire. The tactic worked and a 3rd Kreth vessel exploded in a brilliant flash. The remaining 3 Kreth warships, now outnumbered and having lost half their squadron, began to retreat toward the edge of the system. But Sophie was not done. She ordered the Sacred Mountain to pursue the retreating Kreth ships while the Windtalker and Long Walk maintained position over Red Rock Station. Rachel Stone's communications team coordinated with ground forces, providing orbital surveillance data to help the warriors locate Kreth positions. Jack listened to reports flowing through the network, hearing squad leaders call out targets and casualties, successes and setbacks. On the ground, the battle raged through Red Rock Station's streets. The Navajo warriors fought with intensity that shocked the Kreth troops. Every warrior knew the story of Daniel Morrison's beating and understood they were fighting for justice against brutality. They moved through the colony with purpose, clearing buildings and rescuing colonists while methodically eliminating Kreth resistance. The Kreth warriors were tough and experienced, giving ground slowly and making the humans pay for every meter. But they were used to fighting frightened civilians and disorganized security forces, not trained warriors who coordinated their movements and supported each other with disciplined fire. The Navajo tactics, combining modern combat techniques with warrior traditions of courage and determination, overwhelmed the Kreth defenders. Commander Vex realized his position was collapsing. He ordered his warriors to fall back to the landing field where Kreth shuttles waited. If they could reach the ships, they could evacuate and regroup. But Sophie had anticipated this move and had deployed squads to block the route to the landing field. When Kreth forces tried to fight through, They found themselves trapped between blocking forces and pursuing warriors. Captain Yellowhorse's assault team breached the Kreeth command post after 40 minutes of brutal fighting. They captured 17 Kreeth officers, including the ground commander. Yellowhorse immediately radioed Sophie with the news that the enemy command structure had been neutralized. Across the colony, Kreeth resistance began to crumble as warriors lost coordination and leadership. Lisa Nez's team had secured the hospital and was treating wounded colonists. She found Daniel Morrison in critical care, still unconscious but stable. She posted guards and began organizing medical evacuation for the most seriously injured. In orbit, the Sacred Mountain caught up with the retreating Kreeth warships and disabled their engines with precise fire, forcing them to surrender or be destroyed. As the sun began to set over Red Rock Station, the battle entered its final phase. Isolated groups of Kreeth warriors continued fighting, but most realized they were defeated and began surrendering. The Navajo warriors moved methodically through the remaining contested areas, securing the colony sector by sector. Jack listened to the communications traffic, hearing the relief in warriors' voices as they reported areas secured and civilians safe. The fighting ended as darkness fell over Red Rock Station. The last Kreeth warriors surrendered after Sophie broadcast a message in their language, promising humane treatment for those who laid down their arms. Captain Yellowhorse organized the processing of prisoners, while warriors secured the colony and began assessing damage. The cost of the battle became clear as reports came in from squad leaders across the settlement. 12 Navajo warriors had died during the assault, and 37 were wounded with varying degrees of severity. Lisa Nez and her medical teams worked frantically to stabilize the injured, setting up a field hospital in the colony's community center. The fallen warriors were treated with respect. Their bodies recovered and prepared for return to Canyon World. Each death weighed heavily on Sophie, who knew these people had volunteered because she asked them to. The colonists emerged cautiously from shelters where they had hidden during the battle. Many were in shock, unable to process what had happened. Just hours ago, they had been facing certain death or enslavement, and now they were free because warriors they had never met had traveled across space to save them. Peter Grant moved through the crowds trying to restore order and account for everyone. Jack finally left the Windtalker after Sophie confirmed the colony was secure. He took a shuttle down to the surface with a group of warriors heading to reinforce security positions. When he stepped out onto Red Rock Station's dusty streets, everything looked different. Burn marks, scarred buildings, and debris littered the ground. But the Kreeth were gone and his people were safe. He ran to the hospital where Lisa Nez directed him to his father's room. Daniel Morrison was awake for the first time in days. His injuries still severe but no longer life-threatening. When Daniel saw his son enter, tears ran down his weathered face. Jack knelt beside the bed and his father reached out with a shaking hand to touch his face. Daniel spoke in Navajo, telling Jack how proud he was, how he had heard the sounds of battle and known somehow that his son had done something impossible. Jack told his father everything, the words tumbling out in a mixture of English and Navajo. He described the journey to Canyon World, the council meeting, Sophie and the 400 warriors who volunteered. Daniel listened with wonder, occasionally asking questions or requesting clarification. When Jack finished, his father was silent for a long moment before speaking again. Daniel said that Jack had discovered something about their heritage that could not be taught, only experienced. The warrior tradition was not about violence or aggression, but about standing up for what was right when no one else would. Jack had shown courage not by fighting but by refusing to accept injustice, and by having faith that others would respond to a call for help. That faith had awakened something powerful in people who still remembered what it meant to be warriors. Dr. Helen White came to check on Daniel, and was amazed to find him awake and alert. She cautioned that his recovery would take months and that he would need to return to Earth for advanced treatment his injuries required, but the fact that he was alive at all seemed miraculous given the beating he had endured. She credited Lisa Nez's medical team with providing treatments the colony's limited facilities could not offer. Outside, Sophie and Captain Yellowhorse organized the warrior force for the next phase of the mission. The Kreeth prisoners needed to be secured and transported, which required converting part of the Sacred Mountain into a detention facility. The 2 captured Kreeth warships in orbit needed to be salvaged for intelligence and to prevent them from being used against human forces. And, most importantly, they needed to decide what to do with Commander Vex. The Kreth commander had been captured alive during the final minutes of fighting. He was found hiding in a storage facility, abandoned by his own warriors who chose to surrender rather than die protecting him. Captain Yellowhorse's warriors brought him to the central square in restraints, the same square where he had beaten Daniel Morrison weeks earlier. Word spread quickly and colonists gathered to see the alien who had terrorized them brought low. Sophie stood before the assembled crowd with Captain Yellowhorse at her side. She had Commander Vex brought forward, the tall reptilian looking diminished despite his size. The colonists shouted angrily, demanding justice and revenge. Some called for Vex to be beaten as he had beaten Daniel. Sophie raised her hand for silence and the crowd gradually quieted. She spoke clearly so everyone could hear, explaining that the Navajo warriors had not come to Red Rock Station to commit atrocities or to lower themselves to Kreth brutality. They had come to stop injustice and protect the innocent. Commander Vex would face justice, but it would be proper justice under human law, not revenge. The warrior tradition demanded they be better than their enemies, that they fight with honor even when facing those who had none. Sophie then revealed something that shocked both the colonists and Commander Vex. During the space battle, her forces had captured the two retreating Kreth warships intact with their crews and communication systems. She had already sent a detailed message to the Kreth Empire describing what happened at Red Rock Station. The message included tactical data from the battle, sensor recordings of Kreth warships being destroyed, and information about the warrior network connecting human colonies. The message made several points clear to the Kreth leadership. First, human colonies were not as defenseless as the Kreth assumed. Second, attacks on civilians would be met with military responses that the Kreth could not easily counter. Third, the humans possessed something the Kreth did not understand, a willingness to travel great distances and risk their lives for people they had never met. Finally, the message offered the Kreth a choice: withdraw from human space and live in peace, or continue aggression and face consequences that would escalate beyond anything they wanted. Commander Vex realized the implications and began to understand that his attack on Daniel Morrison had triggered something far larger than he could have imagined. Sophie told him directly that the Kreth Empire now had to choose between peace and a war they could not win. She made it clear that Canyon World was not the only planet with warriors, that there were 12 worlds with strong Navajo communities, and that they were forming a defensive alliance to protect human colonies throughout the frontier. The crowd processed this information with growing hope. They had believed themselves isolated and helpless, but now they learned they were part of a network that would defend them. Peter Grant asked Sophie how long the warriors could stay, and she explained that a full company of 100 volunteers would remain permanently to establish a garrison and train local defense forces. The other 300 would return to Canyon World, but they could be recalled if needed. Over the next 2 days, the warriors helped Red Rock Station begin recovery. Combat engineers repaired critical infrastructure damaged in the fighting. Medical teams treated colonists and stabilized wounded warriors for transport. Intelligence specialists examined captured Kreth technology and interrogated prisoners to learn more about enemy capabilities and intentions. The 3 ships in orbit underwent repairs to make them spaceworthy for the journey home. Jack spent time with the warriors who would be staying, including a squad leader named Paul Gray who would command the garrison. Paul had fought in the assault on the mining facility and carried himself with quiet confidence. He told Jack that the garrison would not just provide security, but would also teach colonists to defend themselves, ensuring that Red Rock Station would never again be helpless against threats. Sophie found Jack on the 3rd evening after the battle. She told him the main force would be departing the next morning, and asked if he wanted to return to Canyon World with them. Jack was tempted but declined, saying his father needed him during recovery and the colony needed people who understood what had happened. Sophie nodded with understanding and told him he would always be welcome on Canyon World, that he had earned a place among them. The morning of departure arrived with clear skies over Red Rock Station. The 3 ships, Windtalker, Long Walk, and Sacred Mountain, had been repaired enough for the journey back to Canyon World. 300 warriors prepared to leave while 100 stayed behind to form the permanent garrison. The colonists gathered in the central square for a farewell ceremony, wanting to honor the people who had saved them. Sophie stood before the crowd and spoke briefly. Her words translated for those who did not understand Navajo. She explained that the warriors had simply done what their traditions demanded, protecting those who could not protect themselves and standing against injustice. She reminded everyone that the garrison staying behind was not just for defense, but to build connections between Red Rock Station and the broader network of Allied colonies. The colonists were no longer alone. Elder Joseph Begay had traveled from Canyon World on a fast courier ship to witness the aftermath of the battle. The old man stood beside his daughter and addressed the colonists in English. He spoke about the warrior tradition and how it had been preserved across generations and light years. He said that what happened at Red Rock Station would be remembered as the moment when isolated human colonies realized they were part of something larger, a community bound by shared values and mutual protection. The elder then did something unexpected. He presented Jack Morrison with a gift on behalf of Canyon World's council. It was a traditional knife crafted by master artisans, with Jack's name etched in both English and Navajo on the blade. Elder Begay explained that the knife symbolized the warrior's path, not just the weapon itself, but the responsibility to use strength in defense of others. He told Jack that he had walked that path with more courage than many who trained their entire lives. Jack accepted the gift with trembling hands and thanked the elder in Navajo, using phrases his father had taught him and new words he had learned during his time on Canyon World. The crowd applauded and many colonists wiped away tears. Jack's journey from desperate teenager to someone honored by warriors had taken only weeks, but he felt he had lived years in that time. Daniel Morrison was brought to the ceremony in a wheelchair, still too injured to stand but insisting on being present. Sophie approached him and knelt so they were at eye level. She told him that his son had done something remarkable, that his courage had inspired 400 warriors to risk their lives. She said that Daniel should be proud not just of what Jack had done, but of how he had raised his son to understand honor and justice. Daniel responded in Navajo, his voice weak but steady. He thanked Sophie and all the warriors for giving his people hope and for showing his son what the warrior tradition truly meant. He said that he would recover from his injuries, but he would never forget what these people had done for strangers they had never met. Sophie clasped his hand and promised that Canyon World would always stand with Red Rock Station. The warriors began boarding their ships as the ceremony concluded. Jack walked among them, shaking hands and thanking individuals who had fought for his home. Lisa Nez hugged him and told him to take care of his father. George Bennett gave him advice about mining operations and told him the colony would thrive now that the Kreth threat was gone. Captain Yellowhorse shook his hand with that iron grip and said Jack had the heart of a warrior, even if he never fired a shot. As the three ships lifted into the sky, the colonists watched until they disappeared from view. The garrison warriors immediately began organizing their operations, setting up a command post in the former Kreth facility and establishing patrol routes throughout the settlement. Paul Gray, the garrison commander, met with Peter Grant to coordinate security protocols and begin training programs for colonist volunteers. In the days following the warriors' departure, Red Rock Station began the process of recovery and rebuilding. Damaged buildings were repaired and systems brought back to full operation. The mining facilities resumed production, but this time the extractium they produced was theirs to use or trade, not tribute forced from them by alien overlords. The colonists worked with renewed energy, knowing they were no longer helpless victims but part of a network that would defend them. News of what happened at Red Rock Station spread across human space through commercial traffic and official channels. Other colonies that had suffered under Kreth aggression heard about the boy who traveled across the stars for help and the 400 warriors who answered his call. Some sent messages of thanks and requests for information about joining the defensive alliance. Others began organizing their own security forces, inspired by the example of colonists who refused to accept oppression. The Kreth Empire received the reports with initial disbelief, followed by growing concern. Commander Vex's defeat was embarrassing, but the broader implications were troubling. Intelligence analysts studied the battle recordings and realized the human warriors had used tactics and coordination that suggested significant military capability. The message from Sophie Begay made it clear that attacking human colonies would no longer be cost-free, and that humans possessed a cultural cohesion the Kreth had not anticipated. High-ranking Kreth officials debated how to respond. Some advocated for immediate retaliation to restore their reputation and discourage other human colonies from resisting. Others argued that the humans had demonstrated capabilities that required reassessment of Kreth expansion plans. After weeks of argument, the Kreth Empire decided to withdraw from most human-controlled space and establish a buffer zone between their territory and human colonies. It was not a formal treaty, but a practical recognition that continued aggression would be too costly. Jack spent the weeks after the battle helping his father recover and working with the garrison warriors. He trained in basic combat skills and weapons use, not because he planned to become a soldier, but because he wanted to understand what Sophie and the others had done for him. Paul Gray became a mentor, teaching him about tactics and leadership while also sharing stories about Canyon World and the warrior traditions maintained there. Daniel Morrison's recovery progressed slowly but steadily. The garrison's medical staff provided treatments that accelerated healing, and Dr. Helen White marveled at technologies she had never seen before. As Daniel regained strength, he spent time teaching Jack more about their Navajo heritage, going deeper into language and culture than he ever had before. Jack absorbed the lessons eagerly, finally understanding why his father had worked so hard to preserve these traditions. 3 months after the battle, Daniel was strong enough to walk without assistance. He and Jack stood together in the central square one evening, looking at the spot where Commander Vex had beaten him. The memory was painful but no longer defined Daniel's existence. He had survived, and his son had proven that one person's courage could change everything. They spoke in Navajo about the future, about rebuilding their lives and their colony, about staying connected to Canyon World and the network of warriors who had saved them. Paul Gray approached them with news that a formal defensive alliance had been established between 12 colony worlds with strong Navajo populations. The alliance included mutual defense agreements, shared intelligence, and coordinated military training. Red Rock Station was invited to join as a protected colony, ensuring they would never again face threats alone. Daniel and Jack accepted immediately, knowing their survival depended on the bonds formed during those desperate days. Jack continued his education in both colonial engineering and warrior traditions. He traveled to Canyon World twice over the next year for extended visits, learning from Sophie and Elder Begay, while strengthening the connections between the colonies. He discovered talents for diplomacy and logistics, helping to coordinate the defensive alliance and serving as a liaison between different communities. Years later, Jack Morrison would look back on the day his father was beaten as the moment that changed his life forever. It was the day he learned that courage meant acting even when success seemed impossible, that heritage was not just history but living tradition, and that calling for help was not weakness but wisdom. The 400 warriors who answered that call had shown him what it meant to be part of something larger than himself, to stand for justice regardless of personal cost. Red Rock Station thrived under the protection of the defensive alliance. The colony grew from 300 families to over 1,000 as word spread about the community that had survived Kreth aggression and built connections with warrior cultures across space. Children grew up learning both practical survival skills and cultural traditions, understanding that strength came not just from technology but from the bonds between people who refused to abandon each other. The story of Jack Morrison and the 400 warriors became legend among human colonies, told and retold with each generation. It reminded people that isolated communities could find strength in unity, that cultural traditions preserved across centuries and light years still had power, and that warriors who fought for justice rather than conquest could change the course of history. The Navajo people who had survived so much hardship on old Earth had proven once again that their spirit could not be broken, and that they would always stand against darkness when the innocent needed protection.